So now we're going to move on to the third type of muscle, which is cardiac muscle. So cardiac muscle is a cross between smooth muscle and skeletal muscle. So we'll see things in cardiac muscle that are similar to skeletal muscle and some things that are similar to smooth muscle. Like skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle is striated. So it has sarcomeres, which give it the dark and light bands, so the striped appearance. But like smooth muscle, the cardiac muscle cells are short and just have one nucleus. But what's very unique about cardiac muscle that is not like smooth or skeletal muscle at all is that the cardiac muscle cells are branched. So you can see on this bottom left picture how the cardiac muscle cell will actually split and branch off. The troponin and tropomyosin are just the same as what we saw in skeletal muscle. And cardiac muscle cells are very similar to the slow oxidative fibers in skeletal muscle. So they have lots of mitochondria, they store oxygen on the myoglobin, and they're very slow to fatigue, which is very good because you don't want your heart to get tired and stop pumping. Cardiac muscle is similar to single unit smooth muscle because all of the cells are connected together by gap junctions. So when the signal comes for the heart to contract, the signal will go through all the gap junctions and the cardiac muscle cells will all contract as a single unit. And that's very important for the heart to be able to pump the blood. Because if you can imagine all of the cardiac muscle cells making up the ventricle, if they were all contracting individually at different times, then the heart would not be able to pump the blood. But if they all contract at the same time, you can squeeze the blood out of the ventricle and then they all relax at the same time and then you can refill the ventricle with blood again. Another thing that is similar to single unit smooth muscle cells is that cardiac muscle cells, some of them are pacemaker cells. So we find these pacemaker cells in the sinoatrial or SA node and the atrioventricular AV nodes. So these pacemaker cells are able to generate their own action potentials without any outside stimulus, and they're what are going to set the heart rate. Also similar to smooth muscle, cardiac muscle is under involuntary control. So it's going to be innervated by sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons from the autonomic nervous system. And also it can be influenced by hormones. So for example, epinephrine released from the adrenal medulla, that will actually speed the heart rate up. The calcium that's needed to bind to the troponin to lift the tropomyosin out of the way for crossbridge cycling to start happening, that's going to be coming from both the sarcoplasmic reticulum and the extracellular fluid. So if you remember from skeletal muscle, all of the calcium came from the sarcoplasmic reticulum for contraction. Whereas in smooth muscle, most of the calcium came from the extracellular fluid and only a little bit from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And cardiac muscle is right in between those two, so calcium will come from both the sarcoplasmic reticulum and some will come from the extracellular fluid. So here's just a picture of a cardiac muscle cell. I just want you to note that the cell is branched. It's also short, and you can see that there's just one nucleus. They're kind of showing you a cross-section view here of the intercalated disc. That's where the gap junctions are located. So another cardiac muscle cell would be on this other side, and it would be joined to the previous cardiac muscle cell with gap junctions. And here's just a microscope view of cardiac muscle cells. So you can see this entire cardiac muscle cell here, and you can see that it's branched. And you can also see these lines, and those are the intercalated discs. So that's where the gap junctions will be located. And then this is just a close-up view of that intercalated disc between the cardiac muscle cells. So you can see the gap junctions there that allow the cardiac muscle cells to all get the signal to contract at the same time and contract as one unit. And then the other thing to point out that's in the intercalated disc are desmosomes. And remember, desmosomes are kind of like Velcro. And so they're going to anchor the cardiac muscle cells together and keep them from ripping apart as the heart is moving, as it's contracting. Okay, a very important thing to star in your notes is that there is no summation of cardiac muscle contractions. So remember when we talked about skeletal muscle, you can actually add those muscle twitches together and eventually you end up with tetanus. So you're not allowing the muscle to relax at all in between, and it just keeps contracting the whole time. So we definitely do not want tetanus in the heart. The reason that is that you want the ventricles to be able to relax in between each contraction so they can fill up with blood. And if you had tetanus in the heart and the cardiac muscle just kept contracting and didn't relax at all, there's no way it would be able to refill with blood, and then you wouldn't be able to pump the blood around. So the reason that we do not have any summation of cardiac muscle contractions is because the action potential that occurs in cardiac muscle cells has a very long refractory period. So here's just a picture of cardiac muscle, and on the left you can see a picture of an action potential in cardiac muscle cells, and we're going to talk about this in the next chapter, why it has this particular shape. But you can see the refractory period of this action potential is really long. So if we superimpose the refractory period of the action potential over the muscle twitch from the cardiac muscle cell, you can see that by the time you come out of the refractory period and are able to generate another action potential in the cardiac muscle cell, that almost all of the cardiac muscle twitch is gone. And so by the time you generate another muscle twitch, the other one that was there previously is pretty much gone, and so you can't add them together, and so there's no way that you can get tetanus in the heart, which is really good because you do want the heart to be able to relax in between contractions and refill with blood. And then this is just a compare with skeletal muscle. So remember in skeletal muscles, the action potentials were actually very short refractory period, and the muscle twitches were pretty long compared to that. So by the time you come out of the refractory period, you can get another action potential. Then you can see that this first muscle twitch is just starting, and then you'd add the next muscle twitch onto it, and so you can add the muscle twitches together in skeletal muscle. And that's just not something that we see in cardiac muscle because their action potential is has such a long refractory period. Okay, and this is a great comparison of the three muscle types. So we've got skeletal muscle. We also have both types of smooth muscle. Remember, we have single unit smooth muscle and multi-unit smooth muscle. And then we also have cardiac muscle. So I would spend some time on this table and study this for the quizzes and exams, because this is a great place to write questions from. So make sure you know what's similar and what's different between these three types of muscles. And lastly, there are 2 skeletal muscle tutorials if you want to check out at home. They're pretty good at explaining how skeletal muscle works.